Atlantic, spring, 1943. The German U-boat U-217 slipped out from its concrete pen on the French coast under the cover of night. The crew moved with silent efficiency, men hardened by months at sea, convinced of their mission's importance. In Berlin, their orders had been clear. Cut the lifeline between America and Britain. Strike the convoys that carried the food, fuel, and weapons that kept the Allies alive. The men carried that purpose with the same certainty as their torpedoes. For the crew, departure carried a mix of tension and pride. The Battle of the Atlantic had been called the Tonnage War, and they believed it was a war they were winning. Reports circulated in mess halls, and briefings told of merchant ships burning in the night, of panicked convoys scattered by a single well-placed strike. Commanders promised that Britain would starve, that America's effort to cross the ocean with supplies would collapse under the relentless attack of the wolf packs. As U-217 cleared the harbor and turned west into the black Atlantic swells, the men believed themselves hunters in a vast ocean where no enemy could match their stealth. One officer, leaning against the periscope housing, remarked to a comrade that, "The Americans are children at sea. They have steel, but not discipline." His words echoed the tone set by Admiral Donitz himself, who told his captains that American seamanship was clumsy, their admirals unimaginative, their convoys nothing more than floating targets. The submarine's diesel engines drummed a steady rhythm as the coast of Europe disappeared behind them. The crew settled into the routine of war patrol. Watches rotated every 4 hours, machinery checked and rechecked, torpedoes polished like relics of faith. To the men, each convoy represented another step toward victory, another reminder that the Reich submarines remained masters of the Atlantic. The storm-gray waters ahead seemed to promise opportunity, not danger. They had no way of knowing that this patrol would bring them face to face with an American admiral's decision that would upend every certainty they carried to sea. Days turned into weeks as U-217 prowled the Atlantic. The crew grew accustomed to the endless rhythm of silence and waiting, broken only by the sudden crackle of the radio or the sharp bark of the watch officer spotting smoke on the horizon. One morning, the submarine surfaced into the pale light of dawn and found itself shadowing the faint outline of a convoy. Black plumes rose from the funnels of merchant ships stretching across the ocean in disciplined rows, escorted by sharp silhouettes of American destroyers. Inside the control room, tension rose. Orders snapped down the chain. Adjust course, prepare torpedo tubes, hold depth. The young sailors whispered among themselves, recalling the stories told in Brest and Lorient, how American ships scattered under pressure, how their captains lacked the ruthlessness to fight back effectively. To them, this convoy was another easy mark, another link in the Allied chain about to be severed. When the first torpedo struck, the men erupted in cheers. Through the periscope, the watch officer saw the orange bloom of fire rising against the gray sea, a freighter heeling over as sailors scrambled on deck. Moments later, the shock of depth charges rippled through the hull as American escorts closed in. But below the surface, confidence held. The crew had survived such hunts before. They whispered the same words that had carried them through earlier patrols. "The ocean is ours." Yet, as the hours passed, something unsettled even the veterans. The destroyers did not break away after a few runs. Instead, they stayed fixed above, moving in precise patterns, pounding the depths with relentless discipline. Each detonation rattled bulkheads, showering rust flakes from the ceiling, sending tools clattering across the floor. In the darkness of the control room, the captain's face was stern. The Americans were not withdrawing. They were not giving up. By nightfall, U-217 had taken damage. Nothing fatal, but enough to shake the crew's certainty. Pumps strained against slow leaks, batteries ran hot, and food sat untouched as men listened to the hammering of sonar pings above. For the first time, the crew began to sense that these Americans were not the careless amateurs they had been promised. Instead, the sea around them felt tighter, as if the hunters were becoming the hunted. By the third day of pursuit, the ocean itself seemed to turn hostile. U-217 had slipped deeper, running silent on batteries, but the destroyers tracked her with uncanny precision. Every creak of the hull, every shift of ballast, seemed answered by another series of charges that rolled through the depths with bone-shaking force. Sailors clutched their bunks or the cold steel of the bulkheads, teeth rattling as if the sea itself were tearing at the submarine's skin. The captain, a veteran of earlier triumphs, tried to keep order. He reassured the men that no escort could hunt forever, that fatigue would break the Americans' discipline. Yet hour after hour, the pattern repeated. Sonar pings, the rumble of screws circling above, and then the concussion slamming through the hull. Sleep became impossible. Faces grew hollow. Men muttered prayers they had not spoken since childhood. When the U-boat surfaced briefly under cover of night to recharge batteries, the crew saw distant flashes of signal lamps and the hard silhouettes of destroyers still on station. It was as if the Americans had created an invisible net around them. The confidence that had carried the crew from France was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear. The enemy would not relent. By dawn of the fourth day, the submarine had taken new wounds. Rivets seeped seawater, gauges flickered in the dim red light, and the smell of oil and sweat hung heavy. The engineering officer reported the batteries near collapse, oxygen growing thin. Options dwindled. The captain called his officers into the control room, his voice low but firm. "We cannot outlast them. Prepare to surface." The order spread through the submarine like a shockwave. To surface under enemy guns meant surrender, humiliation, perhaps death. Yet remaining below meant certain destruction. The crew steeled themselves, fastening life jackets, checking pistols, whispering farewells. When ballast tanks roared and the boat rose, men braced for the blinding light and the thunder of shells. They expected an American fusillade. What they received instead would leave them more shaken than any depth charge. The hatch swung open, and blinding daylight poured into the control room. Sailors scrambled up the conning tower, expecting to see destroyers with guns already trained. Instead, what greeted them was a silent cordon of gray hulls spread across the horizon, their decks bristling with weapons held in check. A single signal flag broke the stillness from the lead American ship, its message carried across the water by flashing lamps. "Hold fire. Prepare to receive boarding party." For a moment, confusion reigned aboard U-217. Men exchanged stunned looks. This was not the ruthless end they had been taught to expect. They had been told that the Americans, like the British before them, would send them to the bottom without pause, that mercy had no place in the Atlantic. Instead, they saw sailors standing calmly at their stations, disciplined, silent, waiting for orders that had not yet come. The German captain raised his binoculars and froze. On the bridge of the lead destroyer stood a tall figure in dress cap and greatcoat. This was no routine escort commander. An admiral himself had come to witness their capture, a presence that spoke volumes. Behind him, signalmen relayed fresh orders, and the German captain realized with a sinking heart that every eye, every weapon, every ship was acting under the will of that single man. The crew whispered among themselves, torn between relief and disbelief. Was this mercy or humiliation? For years, they had lived by the creed of the wolf pack: sink or be sunk, give no quarter. Yet the Americans had stayed their guns. To the prisoners to be, the scene felt unreal. A vast fleet capable of annihilation, choosing instead to restrain its fire. On the conning tower, the German captain inhaled the salt air heavy with smoke and oil, and understood that something larger than survival was unfolding. The admiral's hand had held back destruction, but for what purpose? As the boarding boats began lowering into the water, the U-boat crew braced for an encounter they could not explain, the kind of order that no German officer would ever have given. The American boarding party came fast across the swells, engines growling as sailors in steel helmets and life vests steered toward the battered U-boat. The Germans lined the deck, hands raised, their faces drawn with fatigue and disbelief. No shots were fired, no curses shouted, only the mechanical thrum of approaching engines and the occasional snap of a flag in the wind. When the Americans climbed aboard, their weapons were ready, but their discipline was absolute. Orders were crisp, movements practiced. They checked hatches, secured sidearms, and herded the crew without brutality. To the Germans, it was bewildering. They expected anger, vengeance, perhaps summary execution for the lives they had taken at sea. Instead, they saw procedure, an almost surgical precision that left them unnerved. Below deck, the American officers inspected the submarine's compartments. They moved with a strange mixture of curiosity and authority, noting dials, maps, and torpedo tubes, but never allowing chaos to break their ranks. The German sailors, now prisoners, watched their captors in silence, aware that their fates rested not with these men, but with the admiral whose order had stayed the destroyer's guns. On the horizon, the fleet held steady, engines low, decks bristling with untouched firepower. It was a show not just of strength, but of control. The Germans understood the difference immediately. Their own commanders demanded ruthlessness, preached that mercy was weakness. Yet here was the enemy, capable of erasing them in seconds, choosing restraint as a weapon more powerful than torpedoes. As the boarding party finished their work and raised the stars and stripes over the conning tower, a hush fell across the U-boat deck. The German crew realized with dawning clarity that they were no longer hunters of the Atlantic. They were living witnesses to a different kind of command, one that fought not only with steel and fire, but with discipline, order, and a will that even their own officers had never imagined. The prisoners were transferred one by one into the waiting boats, their boots slipping on the wet planks, their eyes fixed on the gray hulls looming ahead. As they climbed the ladders onto the American flagship, They were met not with jeers, but with silence. The kind of silence that carried weight. Sailors stood at attention, rifles slung, eyes forward. The Germans sensed it immediately. This was not mercy born of weakness, but discipline forged by command. On the bridge, the admiral remained motionless, his greatcoat tugged by the Atlantic wind. He gave no speech, no dramatic gesture, only a curt nod as the prisoners were brought aboard. His officers carried out his orders with an efficiency that unsettled the U-boat crew far more than shouted threats ever could. One German machinist whispered to his comrade that even their enemies seemed afraid, not of them, but of disobeying the admiral's will. In the wardroom below, the officers of U-217 were seated at a long table, watched by armed guards. They waited for interrogation, but what they received instead was something stranger. The admiral himself entered, laid a single map on the table, and spoke in measured English that required no translation. "You will tell me how far your wolf pack stretches, not because I ask as your enemy, but because the sea already answers me. Every signal you send, every boat you lose, we already know. This is not a negotiation. It is a demonstration." The German captain stiffened, realizing that the order to capture rather than destroy was part of something larger, a calculated move to strip away not just their weapons, but their certainty. The Americans had spared them, not for mercy, but to prove a point, that the ocean itself now belonged to a navy that could choose its battles, dictate its terms, and even decide when an enemy lived or died. As the meeting ended and the prisoners were led below decks, the weight of the admiral's order settled over them like the sea itself. They were no longer participants in a hunt, nor even simple captives. They had become unwilling witnesses to a new kind of power, one that spoke louder in restraint than in destruction. The days that followed aboard the American flagship blurred into a strange mixture of routine and revelation for the captured Germans. They were fed regularly, hot meals of coffee, bread, and meat that seemed unthinkable compared to the dwindling rations on their own submarine. Guards watched them closely, but without cruelty. There were no beatings, no shouted insults, no reprisals for torpedoes that had claimed Allied lives. Instead, there was order, precise, calm, relentless order. For the German sailors, it was disorienting. They had been raised on the doctrine that America's forces were soft, undisciplined, incapable of hardship. Yet what they saw each day contradicted that propaganda completely. Sailors rose before dawn, drills conducted with metronomic precision, every man in his place, every task executed as if rehearsed 100 times. The efficiency of it struck the U-boat crew harder than any depth charge. At night, lying on bunks in the makeshift prisoner quarters, they whispered to each other in disbelief. One compared the American galley to a factory line, capable of serving hundreds without chaos. Another noted the spotless engine rooms, where machinery gleamed under constant maintenance. "They treat their ship like we treat a weapon," muttered a petty officer. "Only they have an army of men to wield it." The German captain observed all this in silence, his pride eroded by each passing day. He had expected humiliation, but instead, he encountered something more profound. The realization that America's naval strength was not only in its guns and ships, but in the invisible fabric of discipline binding every man together. Word filtered down that the admiral himself had addressed his officers in private, explaining why he had ordered the capture instead of destruction. It was not charity, he said, but strategy. Every prisoner was living proof to the Reich that American resolve was different, that they could crush without killing, dominate without hatred, and win not just with firepower, but with will. For the Germans, that truth began to settle deeper than any interrogation could force. They had set out to break the Atlantic lifeline. Instead, they had become witnesses to why it would never be broken. Weeks passed as the captured crew settled into the strange rhythm of life aboard their enemy's warship. They were transported under heavy guard, but what struck them most was not their confinement. It was what they were allowed to see. From the deck, escorted between compartments, they caught glimpses of the vast American fleet moving as one. Destroyers sliding into formation with clockwork precision, supply ships replenishing fuel and food at sea, aircraft carriers launching, patrols in perfect sequence. To German eyes, it was staggering. Their own navy had been a force of daring and improvisation, relying on cunning and sacrifice. But this was an industrial machine afloat. The Americans had turned the ocean into an assembly line, where even chaos bent to schedule. One petty officer whispered that he had never seen so many ships moving without signal flags, each captain knowing exactly what to do, as if the entire fleet shared a single mind. The prisoners were not told, but they began to understand why the admiral had spared them. He wanted witnesses, not corpses at the bottom of the sea, but men who would carry home the memory of what they had seen. A navy so vast, so disciplined, that no wolf pack could hope to choke the lifeline it guarded. The U-boat crew realized that their capture was not an accident of mercy, but an act of strategy, a message carved into their very survival. At night, in their bunks, the Germans debated quietly. Some insisted it was theater, a trick of showmanship to break their morale. But others, especially the veterans who had served since the early campaigns, shook their heads. "This is not theater," one said. "It is a system. They have turned war into production, and production into war. We were hunters. They are the ocean itself." By the time their transport neared an American base, the shock had dulled into a deeper recognition. They were no longer merely prisoners. They were eyewitnesses to a form of power their commanders had never warned them about. An empire of discipline and industry, commanded by admirals whose most dangerous orders were not to fire, but to let their enemies live long enough to understand what they faced. When the U-boat crew finally stepped ashore under guard, the shock only deepened. Expecting barbed wire camps and hunger, they found themselves processed with cold efficiency, handed blankets, tagged, and assigned quarters. American military police stood rigid at every gate, but the treatment was orderly, almost businesslike. To men raised on stories of enemy cruelty, the contrast was unsettling. Their compound buzzed with activity, not of despair, but of structure. Prisoners were fed, cataloged, even given medical checks. What struck the Germans most was not the comforts, but the scale. They saw trainloads of supplies rolling in daily: coal, fuel, endless crates of food and equipment. Every movement was timed, every delivery met by waiting trucks, every detail recorded. To soldiers who had fought shortages since 1941, the abundance felt otherworldly. Letters captured after the war revealed their bewilderment. One machinist wrote, "The Americans feed us better as prisoners than we ate at sea. They treat us like pieces of a system, and the system never fails. I no longer believe their fleet can be stopped. It is not a navy. It is a factory with guns." Among officers, the realization carried a sharper sting. The German captain, in private conversation with his men, admitted that their capture had been deliberate. "The admiral wanted us alive. He wanted us to see this, to carry it back. If we had died at sea, we would still believe in German superiority. But alive, we know the truth. We are fighting an enemy who makes war with discipline as much as weapons." The U-boat crew came to understand that their survival was itself part of the battle. They had been spared not from mercy, but from calculation. The admiral's single order had transformed them from enemies into messengers, unwilling carriers of proof that the ocean's balance had shifted forever. What they had seen could not be undone, and what they now knew would outlast the war itself. As spring of 1943 turned to summer, the former crew of U-217 watched from behind wire fences while the war outside ground on. News filtered in through guards' conversations and captured newspapers. U-boats sinking in record numbers, convoys crossing unbroken, American shipyards launching new destroyers faster than Germany could replace its losses. For the prisoners, each headline confirmed what they had already seen with their own eyes. Some clung to pride, telling themselves that the Reich still had secret weapons, that the tide might yet turn. But others whispered that the real secret weapon had already been revealed to them. It was not a new machine, but a way of waging war. Fleets coordinated like assembly lines, commanders who valued discipline over bravado, and admirals who could afford to spare enemies because they knew they could not be stopped. The German captain carried the weight of that revelation heavily. He remembered the order that had spared his crew, and he replayed it endlessly in his mind. No German admiral would have chosen restraint in such a moment. The Kriegsmarine doctrine demanded ruthlessness: sink the enemy, destroy evidence, erase witnesses. Yet the Americans had done the opposite. They had preserved their prisoners as proof, living evidence of American mastery at sea. Interrogators asked questions, but often the Americans didn't need answers. They already seemed to know. Convoy routes, wolf-pack tactics, even the names of U-boat captains appeared in their files. The prisoners realized the futility of silence. The admiral had spoken truth. The sea itself was answering America now. Years later, when these men were freed and returned to Germany, they carried more than memories of defeat. They carried the story of a single command that had rewritten their understanding of war. One American order had turned them from hunters into witnesses, and their testimony would spread further than any torpedo ever could. For them, the war's turning point wasn't just in tonnage lost or convoys saved. It was the day a U.S. admiral chose not to fire, and in doing so, showed why America's Navy had become the most feared at sea. By late 1943, the story of U-217's capture circulated quietly among both sides of the Atlantic. For the Germans, it was told in hushed tones, half disbelief and half warning. An admiral of the U.S. Navy had stayed his guns, not from weakness, but from the certainty of victory. For the Americans, It became a lesson repeated in wardrooms and classrooms, an example of discipline so strong it reshaped the battle itself. Within the prisoner camp, the crew began to reflect on their own traditions. They remembered the brutal orders of the Kriegsmarine. No quarter, no survivors. Sink them all. Mercy was treated as betrayal, and ruthlessness as strength. Yet what they had witnessed at sea turned that logic upside down. The American admiral had won without cruelty. His power lay not only in steel and fire, but in control, the ability to choose restraint without risking defeat. The younger sailors wrestled with this most of all. Raised on Nazi propaganda that mocked American decadence, they now saw a navy that operated with industrial precision, feeding its men, fueling its fleets, and even sparing enemies to serve a larger purpose. Their bitterness gave way to something unexpected: respect. Not love for the enemy, but recognition of a power that could not be denied. For the Americans, the episode became part of a growing confidence. Captains reminded their crews that the strength of the fleet was not measured only in battles won, but in the discipline to fight on their own terms. "We choose how this war is fought," one officer explained, "and that is why we will win it." In the quiet of their barracks, the German prisoners realized they had been drafted into that message. Their survival was not an accident. It was strategy. They were living proof of what made the U.S. Navy unstoppable. Long after the guns fell silent, they would remember that order and how it turned a routine patrol into a legend of the sea. Winter 1944 brought a different rhythm to the prisoner camp. Snow dusted the barbed wire and watchtowers, while the German sailors huddled in barracks heated by American coal. Food still arrived in endless supply: bread, coffee, meat, even cigarettes. It was not luxury, but it was abundance, and every day it reminded them of the difference between the world they had left behind and the one they now lived in. Conversations turned often to the moment of capture. Again and again, men returned to that single order: hold fire. They argued over its meaning. Some insisted it was mere propaganda, a gesture meant to impress rather than destroy. Others shook their heads. They had felt the weight of the American fleet around them, seen the destroyers waiting in silence, watched the admiral on his bridge. That was no show. It was power so absolute it could afford patience. Rumors drifted into the camp of Germany's worsening fortunes. Cities burning under Allied bombs, U-boats hunted to extinction, the Reich itself buckling under pressure from east and west. Each report made the memory of that day at sea sharper. The prisoners realized they had lived through a moment that foretold the whole war's outcome. The same discipline that spared them was the discipline now crushing their homeland, ship by ship, convoy by convoy. The German captain, once defiant, admitted openly what his men already felt: "We believe fearlessness made us strong." But the Americans have shown that discipline is stronger. One admiral's order was worth more than 100 of our torpedoes. His words carried through the barracks, settling like final judgment. By the end of that winter, the laughter that had once echoed on their patrols was gone. In its place remained a sobering truth: they had been allowed to live not for their own sake, but to bear witness. And what they had seen, the will of a navy that could fight by choice, not by desperation, would mark them more deeply than any victory they had ever imagined at sea. Spring 1945, as the Reich collapsed and the war drew toward its violent end, the story of U-217's capture returned to the minds of its surviving crew with renewed force. By now, they knew Germany was finished. News of American armies crossing the Rhine, of bombers turning cities into rubble, of U-boats hunted down faster than they could sail. All of it confirmed what they had first glimpsed on that day in the Atlantic. America's power was not in moments, but in systems. Within the camp, some men still clung to pride, insisting that Germany had fought with more courage, more sacrifice. Yet others, especially those who had watched the admiral on his bridge, countered with quiet certainty. "We fought with courage," one petty officer whispered. "But they fought with certainty. That is why they win." The order that had spared them was remembered not as mercy, but as a declaration that the war's outcome was never in doubt. American officers who visited the camp sometimes spoke to the prisoners. They asked questions about tactics, wolf packs, patrol zones, but always with a calm assurance, as if the answers no longer mattered. To the Germans, it was clear. Their captors were already thinking beyond the war. They had the luxury to plan for peace while Germany bled itself dry. The U-boat captain, writing in a secret diary, admitted the truth he could no longer deny. "Our creed was ruthlessness. Theirs is discipline. We believe victory was hunger and sacrifice. They proved it was abundance and control. When the admiral spared us, he showed us our defeat before it came." By the time Germany surrendered in May, the men of U-217 no longer argued about what that moment had meant. They understood they had witnessed the turning of the sea. Their submarine was gone, their Reich in ruins. But the memory of that single command remained, proof that the might of the United States Navy was not just steel and fire, but the will to decide how wars would be fought and how they would end. Summer 1945. After Germany's surrender, the former crew of U-217 remained in captivity, now more observers than prisoners. The war was over, but the lessons of their capture lingered like salt in the air. American guards treated them with the same unbending order they had seen at sea. Roll call, meals, work details, always precise, never cruel. What struck the Germans most was that victory had not loosened the Americans' discipline. If anything, it had made it sharper. In the camp mess hall, they read newspapers that spoke of new fleets bound for the Pacific, of submarines and carriers assembling with the same industrial rhythm that had crushed the Atlantic War. Some prisoners scoffed, saying the Americans were overreaching, but others remembered the day on the ocean when their own fate had been sealed by one admiral's simple order. "If they choose to fight Japan," muttered one officer, "then Japan is already lost. We know this. We saw it with our own eyes." The German captain carried himself differently now. No longer the hunter of convoys, he walked the barracks with the calm of a man who understood he had been part of history's lesson. When younger sailors pressed him, asking why the Americans had not destroyed them, his answer was always the same: because they wanted us alive to witness. And what we witnessed was the future of war. That future was not measured in torpedoes or depth charges, but in the scale of organization, in the will of admirals who could make decisions beyond the moment. For the prisoners, the realization was bitter but undeniable. The order that spared them had been as devastating to German pride as any sinking. It had stripped away the illusion of superiority and replaced it with respect for a navy that commanded not only ships, but time, strategy, and perception itself. By the time they were told they would eventually be released, many of the crew no longer thought of themselves as defeated submariners. They thought of themselves as witnesses chosen, deliberately, to carry back the story of how America had won the ocean, not just with firepower, but with an order that had rewritten the meaning of command. Autumn 1945. As the war's ashes cooled and Europe began its slow reconstruction, the men of U-217 were finally dispersed to different prisoner compounds. Some would not return home for years, yet all carried the same indelible memory: the moment when an American admiral's order had changed their fate. By then, they had seen enough to understand that what they once believed invincible, Germany's wolf packs, the iron discipline of the Kriegsmarine, was nothing compared to the system that had defeated them. America's Navy was not built on desperation or improvisation, but on an industrial rhythm that never faltered. It was as if the ships themselves were extensions of factories, carrying with them not just weapons, but a philosophy of abundance. The prisoners often recalled the silence on that day at sea. No shells, no fire, no fury, only the sight of destroyers holding their positions, waiting under the admiral's hand. That silence had been louder than any explosion. It had told them the truth. The Americans did not need to prove they could kill them. They had already proven they could choose not to. Some German officers, in later years, would write memoirs filled with excuses: fuel shortages, weather, Allied numbers. But among the captured crew, the story was simpler and sharper. They had been spared not for their own sake, but to witness America's strength. And when they told the tale to families and comrades after the war, it was not the death charges or the interrogations they described first. It was that single command, unexpected and unforgettable. For them, the Battle of the Atlantic ended not with their submarines sinking, but with their survival. And survival, they realized, had been the weapon America chose to wield. It was strategy disguised as mercy, a message carved into their lives that would echo long after the war had ended. That the might of the U.S. Navy was measured not only in fire and steel, but in the power to decide the fate of an enemy with a single word. In the years that followed, as the former crew of U-217 drifted back into civilian life, the memory of that day at sea refused to fade. Some tried to bury it, speaking only of hardship and captivity, but others retold it with almost obsessive detail. The destroyers holding fire, the admiral's calm figure on the bridge, the silence that had carried more weight than 1,000 shells. It became their private legend, a story that separated them from every other U-boat crew lost in the Atlantic. What struck them most, even decades later, was how deliberate it had all been. They came to realize that their capture had not been an accident of chance, but an act of calculated will. The admiral had chosen restraint not as kindness, but as strategy, transforming them into living testimony of American naval power. They had been spared in order to spread a message that the United States Navy could command not only seas and skies, but the very narrative of war itself. When they compared their own commanders to the American they had seen that day, the difference was painful. German doctrine exalted ruthlessness, demanded sacrifice, and often wasted lives in pursuit of fleeting glory. The Americans, by contrast, had wielded discipline as a weapon. They could overwhelm with fire when needed, but they also knew when not to fire. That balance, the Germans admitted, was a form of strength far beyond torpedoes and steel hulls. For the veterans of U-217, the war's outcome was explained not only in factories and shipyards, but in that one moment of command. It was the difference between fighting to survive and fighting with certainty. They had lived through that difference, and it had marked them forever. Even in peacetime, as old men, they confessed that the most haunting sound of the war was not the detonation of depth charges, but the silence that followed the admiral's order. Hold fire.